The afternoon sun slanted through the tall window of the music room, cutting a bright, warm rectangle across the polished wooden floor. Inside that rectangle, tiny dust motes danced and swirled like a silent, glittering ballet. The air smelled of old wood, lemon polish, and the faint, metallic scent of piano wire. It was a peaceful room, a place usually filled with the sounds of learning, the hesitant plinks of a beginner's song, the confident scales of an older student, the gentle guidance of a teacher's voice. But today, the room was heavy with a different kind of quiet. It was a thick, stubborn silence that had a weight to it. A silence that pressed down on the shoulders of the man sitting on the small stool. He was a man in his late 40s, with kind eyes that were usually crinkled at the corners with a smile. Today, however, his brow was furrowed in a mixture of concern and a frustration that had been building for months. He adjusted his glasses, a small, nervous habit, and watched the little girl sitting on the bench in front of the grand piano. The piano itself was a beautiful, imposing beast of black lacquer and gleaming white ivory, and the girl looked impossibly small beside it. Her name was Maya, and she was 7 years old. She had been coming to his lessons for 6 months, and in all that time, felt like he had learned less about her than he had about the dust motes in the sunbeam. Every Tuesday was the same. She would arrive with her mother. A quiet, polite greeting whispered so softly he had to strain to hear it. She would walk to the piano bench and sit perfectly still, her small hands folded in her lap. She never touched the piano unless he asked, and even then, it was like asking her to touch a hot stove. Her hands, which should have been flying over the keys in childhood exploration, would hover a few inches above the ivory, trembling like frightened little birds. Today was no different. He had asked her to play a simple C major scale, the very first thing any student learns. It was just 7 white keys, up and back down. The most basic building block of music. He watched as her right hand slowly, so painfully slowly, lifted from her lap. Her fingers were tiny and delicate, with neat, clean nails. They floated over the keys, a pale shadow against the white. She held her breath. He could see the small rise and fall of her chest stop completely. The room was so still he could hear the slow tick-tock of the metronome on the corner of the piano. A sound he usually turned off for her, but had left on today in a desperate attempt to provide some structure, some pulse to the suffocating quiet. Her index finger extended, a tiny spear of flesh aimed at the middle C key. It came down not with a musical press, but with a timid tap. A single, lonely note echoed in the room. Then, chaos. Her other fingers, seemingly with a mind of their own, clenched into a fist and landed with a soft thud on a cluster of black keys, producing a discordant jangle that made them both flinch. She snatched her hand back as if she had been bitten, her head immediately bowing until her chin was almost touching her chest. Her long, dark hair fell like a curtain, hiding her face from him. A deep sigh escaped the teacher's lips, a sound of pure exhaustion. He had tried everything. He had brought in colorful animal stickers to put on the keys, turning C into a cat and D into a dog. He had tried teaching her simple, silly songs about raining elephants and purple spaghetti. He had promised her ice cream if she could just play one whole line without a mistake. He had spoken to her mother, who could only shrug with a worried look, explaining that Maya was just a very shy and sensitive child. But he knew it was more than that. He had taught shy children before. He had taught sensitive children. He had never taught a child who seemed to have a wall built around her musical soul, a wall so high and so thick he couldn't even find a crack in it. He looked at her now, a small, hunched figure radiating misery. He felt a pang of guilt for his frustration. This wasn't about him or his reputation as a teacher. This was about her. He could see a flicker of something in her, a deep well of feeling behind those guarded eyes. When he played a piece of music, a sad one or a happy one, he would sometimes catch a tiny, almost imperceptible reaction from her. A slight tapping of her foot, a fleeting look of wonder in her eyes before she remembered to hide it. The music was getting in, he was sure of it, but it was trapped inside. It couldn't find its way out through her trembling fingers. The other children in the group, lesson were starting to get restless. A little boy in the corner was doodling on his sheet music, and two girls were whispering to each other behind their hands. He couldn't blame them. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. It was a silent battle of wills, his gentle encouragement against her immense invisible fear. He felt like he was trying to coax a wild bird to eat from his hand, and every time he got close, something would scare it away. He thought about just giving up, about telling her mother that perhaps piano wasn't for her, that maybe she should try painting or dance. But the thought felt like a failure, a betrayal of this little girl who was carrying such a heavy burden for someone so young. He stood up and walked around to the side of the piano, his soft-soled shoes making no sound on the rug. He leaned against the polished wood, feeling its cool, solid surface under his hand. He looked down at the top of Maya's head, at the part in her dark hair. He could see the delicate shape of her ear, the soft, downy hair on her neck. She was just a baby, really. A baby with an old soul and a secret she couldn't tell. He thought of all the joy music had brought him his entire life, the comfort in sad times, the celebration in happy times. He wanted that for her. He wanted to give her that key, that language, that way of expressing everything she held so tightly inside. He took a deep breath, the air filling his lungs and giving him a strange new resolve. The gentle coaxing, the fun and games, the stickers and promises, it was all just noise. It wasn't working. He had been trying to walk around the wall when what he really needed to do was find a door and knock on it firmly. He looked at the clock on the wall. 10 minutes left in the lesson. 10 more minutes of this painful, silent stalemate. Not today. He couldn't do it today. He knelt down on the floor beside the piano bench, bringing himself to her level. The movement made her shrink even further into herself, if that were possible. He waited for a moment, letting the silence settle, and then he spoke. His voice quiet, but with a new, unyielding edge that she had never heard before. The silence that followed his words was a living thing. It wasn't empty. It was packed tight with the shock of what he had just said. The teacher's voice, usually a gentle stream of encouragement, had been a rock dropped into the still pond of the room, and the ripples were now washing over everyone. The little boy in the corner stopped doodling, his crayon frozen midair. The two whispering girls snapped their heads around, their eyes wide. Even the metronome seemed to hold its breath, its pendulum hesitating for a fraction of a second before resuming its relentless tick-tock, which now sounded less like a guide and more like a countdown. Maya didn't move. It was as if she had been turned to stone, a small, dark-haired statue perched on the piano bench. Her head was still bowed, but he could see the muscles in her neck tighten. His words hung in the air between them, sharp and clear. Stop thinking. Stop trying to be perfect. I want you to just play. Put your hands on the keys and play whatever is inside your head. Right now. He had never spoken to her like that before. He had never spoken to any student like that before. It felt like a betrayal of his own teaching philosophy, which was built on patience and kindness. But as he knelt there on the floor, his knees starting to ache against the hard wood, he knew it was a risk he had to take. The gentle way wasn't working. It was like trying to water a plant with an eyedropper. She was thirsty for something. But he was barely giving her a drop. He thought back to the beginning of the lesson just 20 minutes ago. He had been so optimistic. He had put away the scales and the exercises, thinking a familiar song might be the key. Twinkle, twinkle, little star, every child knows it. It's simple, comforting, a little piece of magic set to music. He had played it for her first, his own fingers dancing lightly over the keys, pouring as much warmth and melody into the simple tune as he could. He had watched her face, hoping for a spark of recognition, a smile, anything. But she had just stared at his hands, her expression blank. When he finished, he had asked her to try just the first line, "Twinkle, twinkle, little star." The attempt had been painful. Her hand had lifted, trembling as always. Her thumb had found the C key, but instead of pressing down, it had just rested there, a pale, nervous pressure point. Then her index finger had shot out and hit the G key next to it, producing a jarring note that was completely wrong. She had flinched, pulling her hand back. "It's okay, Maya. It's okay," he had said, his voice soft. "Let's try again. Just C, C, G, G." He had pointed to the keys, singing the notes. She had tried again, and this time her fingers had slipped, sliding off the slick ivory and landing in a messy thud on the keybed. A little sound of frustration, a tiny himph, had escaped her lips. That was new. She was usually just silent. But this time, she was annoyed. At the piano? At herself? At him? He could feel it. The other kids were shifting in their seats, one of them kicking the leg of his chair in a steady, annoying rhythm. The atmosphere was curdling. That was the moment he had abandoned the lesson plan. All his carefully constructed ideas, all his patient strategies, had evaporated in the face of her profound resistance. He was left with a raw, primal choice: give up or push. And he couldn't give up. Not on her. He saw too much potential trapped inside her, a beautiful bird in a cage of its own making. He had to rattle the cage. He had to make a noise loud enough to startle her into flight. Now, kneeling beside her, he could feel the tension radiating from her small body. It was a palpable force, like heat from a fire. He kept his eyes fixed on her, his gaze steady and unwavering. He wasn't angry. He was focused. He was a doctor who had tried every gentle medicine and was now forced to perform a startling but necessary procedure. He needed her to know that this time there was nowhere to hide. No more "I forgot." No more fumbling fingers. No more retreating into a shell of silence. This was it. Slowly, as if moving through thick mud, Maya lifted her head. Her eyes, usually downcast and hidden by her lashes, met his. They were huge and dark, and in them he saw a storm of emotions. There was fear, yes, a deep, primal fear of being put on the spot. But there was something else, too. A flicker of defiance. A hint of the frustration he had seen earlier. She was tired of this game, too. Her gaze flicked away from his for a split second, darting to the corner of the room where her mother sat. Her mother had been a quiet observer for all these months, bringing Maya to her lesson, waiting patiently, and then leaving with a worried smile and a polite thank you. Day. She was leaning forward in her chair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The teacher saw her own anxiety reflected in the mother's face, but when Maya looked at her, something shifted. The mother didn't rush to her daughter's rescue. She didn't offer a comforting word or a reassuring smile. Instead, she gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. It wasn't a nod of happiness, but of resignation, of permission. It was a look that said, "It's okay. You can do this. Whatever happens, it's okay." It was the final push Maya needed, or perhaps the final permission she had been waiting for. Maya's gaze returned to the piano. She looked at the black and white keys, not as an enemy to be feared, but as a challenge to be met. Her shoulders straightened just a fraction. The teacher held his own breath, his heart hammering against his ribs. He had no idea what was going to happen. She might burst into tears. She might slam her hands down in anger. She might just sit there, frozen, until the lesson ended. But he had to wait. He had created this moment, and now he had to see it through. Then she moved. It was the slowest, most deliberate motion he had ever seen her make. Her left hand remained in her lap, a small, pale fist, but her right hand lifted from her side. It rose into the air, not with its usual hesitant tremble, but with a new kind of weight, a new sense of purpose. It floated over the keys, a pale bird surveying the landscape below. The teacher watched, mesmerized, as her long, delicate fingers began to uncurl. One by one, they stretched out, settling into a shape he didn't recognize. It wasn't the simple C major position he had taught her. It was something else, something more complex, more mature. Her thumb hovered over a note deep in the bass, while her other fingers arched over the higher octaves. Her hand was no longer a frightened bird. It was a claw poised to strike. And for the first time in 6 months, the teacher had no idea what was about to happen. The world seemed to shrink to the space between Maya's hovering hand and the waiting piano keys. A second stretched into an eternity. The teacher, still kneeling on the floor, felt a knot of cold dread tighten in his stomach. He had pushed too hard. He had broken something. He pictured her bursting into tears, a storm of childish anger and hurt that he would have to spend months trying to fix. He saw the disappointed look on her mother's face. He had gambled, and it felt like he was about to lose. The other children in the room, sensing the dramatic shift in energy, were utterly still. The little boy's crayon had rolled from his fingers and lay forgotten on the floor. The two girls leaned forward, their mouths slightly open, their eyes fixed on the small figure at the piano. Even the annoying leg kicking had stopped. The only sound was the gentle hum of the air conditioner and the frantic, silent beating of his own heart. Then it happened. Her thumb came down. It wasn't a tap or a press. It was a decisive, confident motion. The note that rang out was not the timid, muffled sound he was used to hearing from her. It was a single, pure tone that seemed to slice through the thick air of the room. It was a C, but a C he had never heard from that piano before. It was clear and full, with a resonance that vibrated through the wooden floor and up through his kneecaps. The note hung in the air, shimmering like a drop of perfect crystal, and for a moment, everyone just stared at the vibrating string inside the open top of the grand piano. It was a sound that demanded attention, a sound that said, "Listen." And then, before that first note had even fully faded, her other fingers moved. They didn't fumble or slip. They danced. Her index finger, middle finger, and pinky came down on 3 keys at once, forming a chord that was dark and full of a strange, beautiful sadness. It was a minor chord, the kind of sound that speaks of rainy days and lost things. It was a sound that had no business coming from a 7-year-old girl who was struggling with Twinkle. Twinkle, little star? The teacher's breath caught in his throat. His mind raced, trying to understand what was happening. Was this a mistake? A lucky accident? But it wasn't an accident. What followed was not a song. It was a story. Her fingers began to move across the keys with a fluid grace that was breathtaking to watch. It was as if someone else were controlling her hand, someone with a lifetime of experience and a heart full of memories. Her right hand played a melody that was intricate and winding, a line of pure liquid gold that flowed over the top of the rich, dark chords from her left. It wasn't happy or sad. It was both at the same time. It was the sound of joy tinged with sorrow, of a memory so beautiful it hurt to remember. He watched her hands, completely mesmerized. Her fingers, which had always seemed so weak and clumsy, were now strong and sure. They stretched and curved in ways he had only seen in professional pianists. She played arpeggios, cascades of notes that tumbled down the keyboard like a waterfall, each one perfectly clear and distinct. The sound filled every corner of the small room, pushing out the stale air and the tension and replacing it with something alive and powerful. It was a complex piece of music, far beyond anything he would ever teach a child or even an adult at this level. It had structure and depth, a beginning, a middle, and a building sense of purpose. He glanced at her mother. The woman was sitting bolt upright in her chair, her hands covering her mouth. Her eyes were wide, and tears were streaming down her cheeks, silent tracks of wonder and disbelief. She wasn't crying from sadness. She was crying from sheer, overwhelming shock. The teacher looked back at Maya. Her head was bowed again, but this time it wasn't in shame or fear. Her eyes were closed, her long lashes casting dark shadows on her cheeks. Her body was swaying slightly, a gentle, rhythmic motion, as if she were a boat rocking on a vast emotional ocean. She was completely lost in the music, a vessel for a feeling that was pouring out of her. Through her fingers and into the world, the music began to swell. The quiet, melancholic melody started to grow louder, more insistent. Her left hand, which had been playing simple, supportive chords, began to move with more complexity, weaving its own countermelody that danced an intricate ballet with her right hand. The sound grew, filling the room until it felt like it might burst through the walls. It was a wave of sound, building and building, carrying everyone in the room with it. The other children were no longer fidgeting or whispering. They were staring, their faces a mixture of awe and confusion. They didn't understand the complexity of the music, but they could feel its power. They could feel the raw, unfiltered emotion in every note. It was like watching a magic trick, but one that touched your soul. The wave of music reached its peak. It was a storm of beautiful, chaotic sound, a torrent of notes that spoke of a love so deep it was heartbreaking, a loss so profound it was a part of her very being. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, it started to recede. The volume softened, the tempo slowed, and the complex melody simplified back into the single, pure line of the beginning. Her fingers, which had been flying across the keys, slowed to a graceful, deliberate pace. She played one last haunting phrase, a question hanging in the air. And then her hands came down together for the final chord. It was a perfect, resonant minor chord that seemed to contain the entire story she had just told. The sound was huge and full, and it echoed in the room, hanging in the air like a thick, heavy blanket. And then it faded. The last vibration of the strings died away, and the room was plunged into a silence that was more profound. It's more absolute than any silence that had come before. It wasn't an empty silence. It was a deafening, awe-filled silence. It was the silence of a shared, breathtaking experience that no one knew how to process. No one moved. No one spoke. The teacher remained on his knees, his mouth agape, his mind completely blank. The mother's silent tears continued to fall. The children were frozen, as if afraid that any sound might shatter the magic that had just happened. The only movement was Maya's, as her hands slowly lifted from the keys, her fingers uncurling as if waking from a long, deep dream. She looked at her own hands with a dazed and confused expression, as if she had no idea how they had just done what they did. The silence in the room was a physical presence. It pressed in on them, thick and heavy, absorbing all sound and all thought. It was the kind of profound quiet that follows a thunderstorm, when the world seems to hold its breath in awe of the power it has just witnessed. The teacher remained on his knees, his joints protesting against the hard floor, but he felt none of it. His entire being was focused on the lingering echo of the music that had just filled the space. His mind, usually a sharp and analytical tool, felt like a blank slate. He had no frame of reference for what had just happened. In his 20 years of teaching, he had heard prodigies. He had heard naturally gifted students. He had never heard anything like this. It wasn't just technically perfect. It was alive. It had a soul. His eyes were fixed on Maya. The transformation was startling. The confident, almost possessed musician who had just commanded the piano was gone. In her place was the same small, frightened girl he knew, but magnified. Her hands were now resting in her lap again, but they were clenched into tight little fists. Her shoulders were hunched, and her face was turned away from him, hidden by a curtain of dark hair. A deep, red flush was creeping up her neck and spreading across her cheeks, the color of shame and confusion. She looked like she had been caught doing something terribly wrong, and he realized with a jolt that, in her own mind, she had. She had broken the biggest rule of all. She had been seen. A soft, almost inaudible sniffle broke the spell. It came from the corner of the room. The teacher's gaze shifted to Maya's mother. The woman was no longer leaning forward in her chair. She had slumped back, one hand pressed tightly against her mouth, as if to hold back a sob. Tears were flowing freely down her face, not in quiet streams, but in silent, heaving waves. Her shoulders shook with the force of her emotion. But her eyes were locked on her daughter, and in them, the teacher saw a maelstrom of feelings. Shock. Yes, but also a deep, piercing grief, and something that looked strangely like recognition. She wasn't just surprised by the music. She understood it. The other children were frozen in a state of wide-eyed wonder. They looked from the piano to their teacher, to Maya's weeping mother, their young minds struggling to process the intense emotional current that had just swept through the room. They didn't know what the music was, but they knew it was important. They knew it was real. The little boy who had been doodling was now staring at Maya with a look of pure reverence, as if she had just revealed herself to be a superhero. The teacher knew he had to say something. He had to break the silence before it crushed them all. He slowly pushed himself up from the floor, his knees cracking softly in the quiet. He walked back to his stool and sat down, his movements feeling clumsy and loud. He cleared his throat, but the sound came out as a dry, rasping croak. He tried again, his voice barely a whisper, filled with a reverence he had never felt before. Maya, he said, his voice cracking on her name. At the sound of his voice, she flinched, shrinking even further into herself. She shook her head, a small frantic motion. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice so thin it was almost carried away by the hum of the air conditioner. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to." The word struck him like a physical blow. Sorry. For creating the most beautiful, heart-wrenching music he had ever heard. He felt a wave of protective tenderness wash over him. He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, trying to make himself smaller, less threatening.
Oh.
"No, Maya. No," he said, his voice gaining a little strength. "Don't be sorry. That was incredible. Where did that come from? Did you learn that from a recording?" Maya shook her head again, her face still buried. He could see her small body trembling. The other children were now looking at him, waiting for an explanation, for the adult in the room to make sense of the magic. He looked to the mother for help, and saw that she had finally lowered her hand from her mouth. She took a deep, shuddering breath and wiped her tears with the back of her hand. "It's her grandmother's song," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Oh my goodness. It's her grandmother's song." The teacher looked from the mother back to the little girl, the pieces of a 6-month-long puzzle suddenly clicking into place with a force that made him dizzy. Her grandmother? He remembered the mother mentioning once in passing that Maya's grandmother had passed away recently. He had filed it away as a sad but unrelated detail. He turned his attention back to Maya, his voice now impossibly gentle. "Your grandma's song, Maya? Is that what you said?" Maya finally lifted her head, just enough for him to see one of her dark, tear-filled eyes. She gave a tiny, hesitant nod. "Ma'am," she hummed, the sound catching in her throat. "Can you tell me about it?" Coaxed. "It's the most beautiful song I've ever heard." A fresh wave of shyness washed over her, and she looked down at her clenched fists. She used to play it," Maya whispered, her voice so low he had to strain to hear. "On the big piano at home? Before she went to sleep in the sky." The teacher's heart ached at the childlike description of death. He glanced at the mother, who was now crying quietly again, but with a soft, sad smile on her face. "Her grandmother," the mother explained, her voice a little stronger now, "was a concert pianist. She traveled all over the world. That piano in our living room was her most prized possession. Since she passed away, it's been silent. We can't bring ourselves to touch it." She looked at her daughter with a new understanding. I never knew you were listening so closely, sweetie." Maya seemed to take courage from her mother's words. "I sit next to it sometimes," she said, her voice a little clearer. "When no one is home, I try to remember how it sounded. I try to make my fingers do what her fingers did, but I'm always scared I'll get it wrong. I'm scared I'll make it sound ugly." She looked at the teacher, her eyes pleading for him to understand. "I didn't want to make her song ugly. There it was. The secret. For 6 months, he had been trying to teach a little girl how to play the piano. But she wasn't a beginner. She was a guardian of a memory. Every time he asked her to play Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, she wasn't failing to learn a simple tune. She was wrestling with the ghost of a masterpiece. The fumbling fingers weren't a lack of coordination. They were the terror of a child trying to hold something infinitely precious and being terrified of dropping it. The silence wasn't shyness. It was reverence. He hadn't been teaching a reluctant student. He had been trying to force a grieving child to betray the most sacred memory she possessed. He felt a profound sense of shame, mixed with an overwhelming awe. He had pushed her, forced her into a corner, and in doing so, he had accidentally unlocked the door to her soul. He hadn't broken her. He had set her free. He looked at the beautiful, imposing black piano, and for the first time, he saw it not as an instrument, but as a sacred vessel, a keeper of stories and a bridge between the living and the dead. He stood up and walked. Slowly over to Maya. He didn't kneel this time. He stood beside her, a quiet, supportive presence. He placed a hand gently on her trembling shoulder. "Maya," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "that was the most beautiful thing I have ever heard. You didn't make it ugly. You made it more beautiful than I can imagine. Your grandmother. She would be so, so proud of you. You didn't just play her song. You kept it alive." The words hung in the air, a gentle balm on a raw, open wound. You kept it alive. Maya looked up at the teacher, her tear-streaked face a mixture of disbelief and dawning hope. The heavy weight of shame that had been pressing down on her small shoulders seemed to lift just a little. The teacher gave her shoulder a final, gentle squeeze before stepping back to give her space. The spell was broken. The other children, who had been holding their breath as if they were underwater, suddenly remembered how to breathe and move. They began to gather their sheet music in bags, their movements quiet and subdued. They filed out of the room one by one, each of them casting a last awestruck glance at the little girl at the piano. They didn't fully understand what they had witnessed, but they knew they had been part of something special, something they would talk about on the playground for days to come. Soon, only the three of them were left in the sunlit room, Maya, her mother, and the teacher. The silence that settled over them was different now. It wasn't the heavy, suffocating silence from before the music, nor was it the stunned, breathless silence that followed it. This silence was warm and comfortable, a soft blanket woven from shared understanding and unspoken emotion. Maya's mother walked over to the piano and knelt beside her daughter, wrapping her arms around the small, trembling body. Maya buried her face in her mother's shoulder, and for the first time her sobs were not silent. They were the loud, messy, healing sobs of a child who had been carrying a burden far too heavy for her years. The mother just held her, rocking her gently, whispering words of love and comfort that were meant only for her. The teacher stood by his stool, feeling like an intruder on a private, sacred moment. He busied himself by straightening the sheet music on the stand, his hands moving with a quiet, respectful grace. He gave them their space, his heart swelling with a mixture of profound relief and a humbling sense of wonder. He had been a teacher for so long, thinking his job was to impart knowledge, to shape talent. But today he had learned that sometimes his job was simply to listen, to create a space where a story could be told, even without words. After a few minutes, Maya's sobs quieted to soft hiccups. Her mother helped her wipe her face with a tissue from her purse. "Are you okay, sweetie?" she asked, her voice soft. Maya nodded, her eyes red-rimmed but clear. "I'm tired," she whispered. "I know, baby," her mother said, kissing her forehead. She then stood up and turned to the teacher, her expression one of deep gratitude. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I don't know what you did, but thank you." The teacher shook his head, a modest smile on his face. "I didn't do anything," he said honestly. "She did it all. I just stopped trying to teach her and started listening." In the weeks that followed, everything changed. The Tuesday lessons were transformed. The beginner books with their simple melodies and colorful stickers were put away in a cabinet, probably for good. The teacher no longer saw himself as an instructor, but as a guide, a musical scribe. He would start each lesson by sitting next to Maya on the bench and simply asking, "What do you hear today?" At first, Maya was still hesitant. She would play a few notes, a fragment of a melody, and then stop, looking at him for approval. But he would just smile and say, "That's beautiful. What comes next?" He began to teach her how to write down the music in her head, not with strict rules of theory, but by helping her find the notes on the piano and notating them on blank staff paper. He was helping her give a voice to the memories that were swirling inside her. Sometimes she would play a happy skipping tune that she said was from a picnic in the park with her grandmother. Other times, she would play a stormy, dramatic piece that she described as the time the thunder scared Grandma's cat. Frightened girl began to disappear, replaced by a focused and confident young musician. Her posture changed. She no longer hunched over the keys as if afraid of them. She sat tall, her shoulders back, her hands moving with a growing assurance. She started to ask questions. "What's this chord called?" she would ask, after playing a particularly beautiful combination of notes. "Can we make it sound sadder? Happier?" The piano was no longer a source of fear and pressure. It had become her playground, her diary, her closest friend. Her mother became a part of the process too. She started to stay for the whole lesson, sitting in the same chair in the corner. But now, she wasn't a worried observer. She was an active listener. Sometimes Maya would play a melody, and her mother would say, "Oh, I remember that one. Your grandma used to hum that while she was gardening." These shared memories became a bridge, connecting the three of them in a circle of healing and remembrance. The silence in their home was finally broken. The grandmother's piano was no longer a monument to loss, but a living, breathing instrument of love. One afternoon, a few months later, the teacher suggested something new. "Maya," he said gently, "I think it's time. I think you should play your grandmother's song again." For us, Maya looked at the keys, a flicker of the old fear in her eyes. But it was just a flicker. She took a deep breath and nodded. Her mother came and stood beside the piano, her hand resting on her daughter's shoulder. The teacher sat on his stool, ready to be a listener, just as he had been on that life-changing day. Maya's hands settled on the keys. There was no hesitation this time. She began to play, and the same haunting, beautiful melody filled the room. But it was different now. It was clearer, stronger, more nuanced. She had been working on it, refining it, pouring her own growing understanding and love into every note. As she played, her mother closed her eyes, a single, happy tear tracing a path down her cheek. The teacher watched Maya's hands, no longer trembling, but dancing with a life of their own. He saw the story in the music, the love, the loss, the memory, and now, the healing. When she played the final chord, the sound echoed and faded into a peaceful, comfortable silence. It was the same silence that had followed her performance that first day, but it felt completely different. Then, it was a silence of shock and confusion. Now, it was a silence of reverence, of shared memory, of love. Maya lifted her hands from the keys and looked at her mother, a bright, confident smile on her face. In that moment, the teacher knew that the silence that day hadn't been an ending at all. It had been a beginning. It was the moment a little girl found her voice, and in doing so, taught a humble teacher that the most important music doesn't come from a page, but from the heart.